Hello and welcome to the first True Crime Marathon. I am Alan Gotro, your host and sometime narrator. Recently, we placed a series of polls on what episodes you would like to see as the subscriber. We put them on the community section of the channel. There were many responses, and we tried to be fair regarding the placement of those episodes. It appears that there will be more marathons after this one from the abundance of responses. So we hope you enjoyed this first in a series of marathons. Also, I wanted to issue some shout outs to subscribers that have been here for a while, and I did not want them to feel neglected. So here they are. Alexa Lake, Robin, Epic Mango, Shay Was the Best, 1, Bonita Martin, Jeanette Amundsen, Johnny S3, Laura Dunn, Caroline LaBelle Carlin, Homo Sapiens, Vampire Queen, Whitley Keffer, Reg Z Zeus, Faces of the Forgotten, Leica Thunderchild, Light Yagami Dezu, Pandemic, Alina Morlock, Alex Wallace, Darkside Ballerina, Jalem M, Suze MCT, Rarely Sociable, Linda Aringian, Sly a Spy, John Klein, Enlightened Patriot, Nicola, Anne Helene Groven, Old Pilgrim, Vinny Vidivici, very clever, James Hugga, Brian Logan, Anam Kara, and Lisa. Now, I'm sure we missed a few names in that, but there will be more opportunities to recognize our subscribers. So, without any further ado, here is the show.
Hamilton Albert Fish was born on May 19, 1870. His father, Randall Fish, was a riverboat captain and later fertilizer manufacturer. Randall was 43 years older than Hamilton's mother, Ellen Howell, and at the age of 75 on October 16, 1875, died from a massive heart attack at Washington's 6th Street Station. Albert was 5 years old. Albert was originally christened Hamilton Walter Fish, but preferred the name Albert after a dead sibling. It turns out when the young boy went to school, other children referred to him as, quote, ham and eggs, end quote, the nickname given to Albert when confined to an orphanage at a young age. Albert's mother sent the boy to the St. John's orphanage after her husband passed away, as she could not support that many children on very little money. Fish learned during the course of his remonstrance to the home about homosexuality and sadomasochism, especially with the frequency of the beatings he received. It seemed that he misbehaved on purpose just to feel the sting of the headmistress's whip. Fish began to enjoy physical pain as a sexual release. Fish remembered,
"I was there till I was 9, and that's where I started wrong. We were mercifully whipped. I saw boys doing things they should not have done."
Fish never went into any details about the meaning of that statement, but learning more about his criminal history can only cause researchers and historians studying the criminal to shudder in disgust and disbelief. In 1879, with this perverted education, Ellen Howell Fish, Albert's mother, found employment with the U.S. government and was able to remove young Fish from St. John's Orphanage. In 1882, Fish began a relationship with another 12-year-old boy. This companion introduced Fish to other sexual practices that allowed for the most extreme perversions ever encountered in human behavior. These behaviors included urolagnia, the drinking of urine, and coprophagia, the eating of feces. Fish also saw his deviant sexual desires escalate, and he visited Turkish baths where he watched other boys undressing and masturbated while he observed. It was also at this point that Fish began to write obscene letters to women through the classified ads in various newspapers. At or about 1890, Fish arrived in New York City and, seeing no other way to support himself, became a male prostitute, having sex with only men. Also at this time, Fish began raping young boys, feeding his most perverted desires. After 8 years of this type of lifestyle without the knowledge of his family or his mother, Ellen Fish determined that her son needed to be married. She arranged a union with a young woman named Anna Marie Hoffman, who was 9 years younger than Fish. The couple eventually had 6 children: Albert, Anna, Gertrude, Eugene, John, and Henry Fish. Unbeknownst to the children, Fish carried on with his deviant behavior. After his marriage to Anna Hoffman in 1898, Fish worked as a house painter and continued to molest children, mostly boys under the age of 6. While working as a house painter, one of Fish's male lovers brought him to a waxworks museum where he noticed one exhibit in particular. The artist rendered the bisection of a penis, and soon thereafter he developed a morbid fascination with castration. Fish soon tried this with a young mentally challenged man, and before Fish could actually begin the act, the young man fled. After this incident and his inability to finish it, Fish developed an additional obsession with sexual mutilation. Thereafter, Fish visited brothels and requested brutal beatings to satisfy his sexual urges. In 1903, Fish was caught embezzling money from a place where he worked, and the court sentenced him to Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. While in Sing Sing Prison, Fish indulged with his homosexual fantasies and practiced great promiscuity with the men there for the entire time of his incarceration. Authorities released him a short time later, but Fish continued his behavior subsequent to his release. In 1910, when Fish began working in the Wilmington, Delaware area, he met a 19-year-old man named Thomas Keaton. Keaton, a mentally challenged young man, suffered from various perversions heaped upon him through Fish's insistence. After a sadomasochistic relationship over 2 weeks, Fish brought the young man to an abandoned farmhouse where the torture continued. At the climax of his tormenting, Fish cut off half of Keaton's penis, doused it with peroxide, then wrapped the profusely bleeding appendage with a Vaseline-covered handkerchief. Fish left $10 for the bleeding young man, kissed him on the forehead, then left. Thomas Keaton's whereabouts after this incident are lost to history. In 1917, Fish's wife began an affair with John Straub, a handyman that lived with the Fish family. Anna soon left Fish for Straub, forcing him to raise 6 children on his own. Eventually, Anna divorced Albert because she claimed he was, quote, shiftless, lazy, and wouldn't take care of his family, end quote. Soon after this rejection, Fish stated that he began to experience auditory hallucinations. At one point, these hallucinations forced Fish to wrap himself in a carpet and claim to follow the instructions of St. John the Baptist. In 1919, Fish stabbed a mentally retarded boy in Georgetown, Washington. Over the course of his reign of terror, Fish's victims were predominantly mentally handicapped or black because Fish believed they would not be missed. In 1924, Fish noticed an 8-year-old girl named Beatrice Keel playing alone on her family's Staten Island farm. Fish offered the little girl money to help him look for some rhubarb in the farms in the area. When the girl's mother saw that little Beatrice was talking to a strange man, she went outside and demanded Fish leave. Fish left the area quickly in the hopes that he would not be identified by Beatrice's mother, but tempted fate again when he returned to the area. In fact, he went to sleep in the family's barn when Beatrice's father, Hans Keel, noticed something strange. When Hans Keel went out to the barn, he found Fish there and chased him away. On the night of February 14, 1924, the parents of Francis McDonald, Mr. and Mrs. Albert McDonald, a Staten Island police patrolman, called the police to report that their 8-year-old boy was missing. Search parties later found the boy's body hanging from a tree in a wooded area not too far from his home. A later autopsy determined that young Francis suffered from a brutal sexual assault, and the killer used the boy's suspenders to strangle him to death. Furthermore, he suffered extensive lacerations to his legs and abdomen, and his left hamstring had been stripped of its flesh. Authorities arrested 3 men in connection with the murder and questioned them extensively. Zona Wade, alias Smith, was being held in Newark, New Jersey, and Mrs. McDonnell identified Wade as the man seen with her son. Aquilo Esposito had been identified by a neighbor that he stated he was in the woods where Francis had been located and stated to the woman, quote, "I saw a mother searching for her boy in the woods. Something happened to him," end quote. The police brought Esposito into the local precinct for questioning because they wanted to know how Esposito knew the boy was missing. And the third man, named Milton Ware, a dishwasher, confessed that he murdered little Francis, but later repudiated the confession. As the police held Ware for more questioning, and the district attorney sought an arraignment of the suspect on suspicion of murder, District Attorney Albert C. Fatch stated that Ware had confessed to the murder of little Francis McDonnell, but later recanted. Mrs. McDonnell later confronted Ware, and he showed very little, if any, emotion at the confrontation. When police arrested Ware, he had a small rubber ball that allegedly belonged to the McDonnell boy. Mrs. McDonnell identified the ball in Ware's possession as closely resembling one that Francis held in his hands on the day of his disappearance. At the time that Francis did not return home, Jenny Carlson, the 17-year-old neighbor of the McDonnells, stated that she was chased by a man closely resembling the suspect Ware, and by Jacob Stern, another McDonnell neighbor, who saw the head and shoulders of a man in the tall grass of the vicinity, and Albert McDonnell, Francis' 6-year-old brother, who was with Jacob Stern at the time he saw the head and shoulders of the man being held by the police. Little Albert earlier identified Esposito as the man he saw with his older brother, but D.A. Fatch and Police Captain Ernest L. Van Wagner placed little credence in the child's identification. In their desperation to identify the killer, authorities took note of the number of children that had gone missing within the previous 10 years of the McDonnell murder. Medical science stepped forward with a theory concerning the reason why persons commit such atrocities. Dr. J.A. Bailey of the American Endocrine Laboratories of New York stated, quote, "We can definitely explain practically all of the prevalent murders of boys throughout the country. They are due to the faulty actions of glands," end quote. Dr. Bailey tried to substantiate his conclusions by continuing that there were a number of glands in the human body that secrete substances that can affect the mental condition of the brain. Looking at such a conclusion with a 21st century lens seems quite elementary, but in 1924, forensic science was in its infancy, and any help that could locate a murderer of young boys or girls would surely be welcomed by law enforcement. Authorities continued to search for the killer, and on one hot night, they believed they surrounded the one responsible for Francis McDonnell's death. On August 17, 1924, John Estosky gave chase to the Staten Island police and engaged in a literal running gun battle with them. After ducking into some woods, Estosky opened fire, thus forcing police officers to return that fire. Estosky sustained serious wounds during the fray. Police drove him to the hospital where he died the next day. The case then grew cold. In South Brooklyn in the winter of 1927, a 4-year-old boy, William Billy Gaffney, had been missing since that Friday, February 11, 1927. Neighbors and relatives searched for the little boy for 2 days before the police acknowledged him as being missing. Edmund and Elizabeth Gaffney worried frantically about their little child, and the police convinced them that they needed rest while law enforcement searched for the boy. Police surmised that Billy and another young friend, Edward Beaton, played on the street, as children do, and one of the parents of the boys, Mr. Beaton, Edward's father, turned his back. Billy had disappeared. When police tried to question little Edward, he kept saying something about the, quote, boogeyman, end quote. Again, police were stumped. The detectives involved in the case followed every lead to its possible conclusion. It was like Billy and the boogeyman disappeared into thin air. On May 25, 1928, Edward Budd, an 18-year-old youth, placed a classified advertisement in the New York World where he stated, quote, "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street," end quote. Following the appearance of the advertisement, a 58-year-old man arrived at the Budd residence and introduced himself as, quote, Frank Howard, end quote, a farmer from Farmingdale. Mr. Howard visited the family at their residence under the pretense of hiring young Edward Budd. But when he arrived, Howard took a keen interest in the Budd's 10-year-old daughter, Grace. Mr. Howard stated that he would hire Edward and would send for him at a later date. At his second visit, Howard convinced Edward and Grace's parents, Della Flanagan and Albert Budd, to have Grace accompany the stranger to a birthday party at his sister's home that evening. Howard left the other Budd children there and brought Grace with him. The Budds never saw their daughter alive again. The police arrested a 66-year-old man named Charles Edward Pope and charged him with kidnapping Grace Budd, although no ransom note arrived at the Budd residence. Pope eventually spent 106 days in jail merely because of an accusation made by his ex-wife. The disposition of Grace Budd would have to wait 6 years after her disappearance before the truth became known. On February 6, 1930, Fish became a bigamist when he married Mrs. Estella Wilcox at Waterloo, New York. Fish's divorce from his first wife, Anna, would not become final for another year. Fish divorced Wilcox 6 days later and then got arrested for sending a really obscene letter to a woman. Doctors placed Fish in Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital in 1930 and 1931 respectively for observations. But it wasn't until one letter he wrote that gave the police the break they needed to solve the cases of missing children that had plagued the city for such a long time. Fish always had the habit of writing letters, some to his children, but others would probably be considered pornographic. It was his penchant for writing that caused him to pen a letter where he would later be identified as the mysterious, quote, Mr. Frank Howard, end quote, who allegedly abducted young Grace Budd. In a demented attempt to partly brag about his exploits and perhaps provide the Budds with some sort of closure, in November 1934, an anonymous letter arrived at the Budd residence.
On Sunday, June the 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her. On the pretense of taking her to a party, you said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her, and she said she would tell her mommy. First, I stripped her naked. How did she kick, bite, and scratch? I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was, roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. She died a virgin.
The author of the letter related that cannibalism had run rampant in the East, and he knew someone who actually went to China, where children were murdered and then slaughtered to avert the others from suffering from famine. Mrs. Budd could not read, so her son, Edward, read the letter to her. Fish later admitted to his lawyer that he did sexually assault Grace, but no one believed him as he was a compulsive, pathological liar. Police quickly noted that the envelope used to mail the letter came from the New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association, where a janitor took some of the stationery in the envelopes for his own use, but left it at a rooming house where he had been staying. The person who occupied the room after the janitor was Albert Fish. When the lead investigator on the case, William King, went to the boarding house to question the landlady, she stated that Fish checked out of the rooming house a few days earlier, but that his son left some money there for Fish and he would be there soon to pick it up. Detective King waited patiently for a few days outside of the rooming house until Fish returned. When Fish finally did make an appearance at the boarding house, the landlady stalled his departure by offering him a cup of tea. Detective King then arrived and asked the man holding the cup of tea if he was Albert Fish. Fish nodded in the affirmative and agreed to go with the detective for questioning. As the two got outside of the apartment, Fish pulled a razor blade on Detective King and King disarmed him. Immediately, Detective King brought Fish to the station. On December 13, 1934, Hamilton H. Albert Fish was formally arrested for the murder of Grace Budd. During the interrogations with Detective King, Fish confessed to the murder of Grace Budd. When detectives went to the Westchester house where Fish allegedly murdered and dismembered Grace Budd, they discovered some adult bones in the basement and surmised that Fish murdered an adult woman and her son. Before his arraignment, Acting Captain Thomas Dugan questioned Fish about the murder of Grace Budd. He asked the accused killer as to what time he killed the girl. Fish responded that they left the girl's house at 12 noon and he murdered her at 4 p.m. When Captain Dugan asked Fish why he wanted to kill the girl, Fish responded,
I had no intention of taking the girl. I wanted to take her brother. She just happened to walk into the room and I took her.
Strangely, during this conversation relating to Grace Budd, Captain Dugan asked Fish if he had killed any other children, and he denied having anything to do with the murder of other children. Again, his compulsivity surfaced. On the affidavit of Detective William King, Albert Fish was arraigned on the charge of first-degree murder of Grace Budd and held without bail. Due to the statements of Fish's son, Albert, Fish alleged that he felt guilty about Grace's death and often awoke in the middle of the night screaming her name. When his father was arrested for the murder of Grace Budd, Albert Jr. exclaimed, quote, "That old skunk, I knew something like this would happen," end quote. Concerns over Fish's behavior and mental health caused authorities to maintain a constant watch over Fish while he was incarcerated. After an intense mental examination by period alienists, doctors judged Fish to be sane and able to stand trial. Doctors James F. Vavasseur and Charles I. Lambert examined Fish and determined through their expertise that Fish exhibited behavior of, quote, "the worst kind of sadist who derived a sexual thrill from the alleged murder of the Budd girl," end quote. Arraigned in early January, Albert Fish was scheduled to stand trial for the murder of Grace Budd on March 11, 1935. On the Saturday night before the trial, Fish attempted suicide with a very sharp chicken bone to his neck. Doctors who examined the wounds stated that they would be painful but not serious. But police closely guarded the defendant as they did not want the executioner cheated. On March 14, 1935, after the jury selection, the state of New York called their first witness, Dr. Harry Strusser, a dentist from the New York City Board of Health. The prosecution called Dr. Strusser to the stand to identify the remains found as those of Grace Budd. Dr. Strusser, quote, was shown the skull and teeth of the child and told the jury they checked perfectly with Grace Budd's dental chart, end quote. The prosecution then called Captain John Stein, head of the New York City Missing Persons Bureau, who testified as to accompanying Fish to the Wisteria cottage where they discovered the bones of Grace Budd. Captain Stein went on to demonstrate how Fish initially murdered Grace Budd. Repeating the defendant's words, Captain Stein testified, quote, "I grasped her throat and choked her like this. Then I cut her head off," end quote. On the following day, March 15th, Gertrude Fish DeMarco, Fish's daughter, came to the witness stand. The defense hoped to prove some form of insanity in order to save their client's life. Fish became teary-eyed, and his beloved daughter testified as to her life growing up with her father. Albert Jr. did not help the defense at all, as he described how his father, quote, devoured raw steak on days when a full moon was visible and tortured himself with a spiked paddle and by injecting needles into his body, end quote. Elizabeth Gaffney visited Fish in Sing Sing, accompanied by Detective King. Mrs. Gaffney wanted closure, but Fish would not give it to her. But in a later letter to his attorney, James Dempsey, Fish wrote about the murder of Billy Gaffney in detail.
I brought him to Riker Avenue dumps. There's a house that stands alone not far from where I took him. I took the G-boy there, stripped him naked and tied his hands and feet and gagged him with a piece of dirt rag I picked out of the dump. Then I burned his clothes, threw his shoes in the dump. Then I walked back and took the trolley to 59th Street at 2 a.m. and walked home from there. Next day, about 2 p.m., I took tools, a good heavy cat o' nine tails, homemade, short handle. Cut one of my belts in half, slit this half in 6 strips about 8 inches long. I whipped his bare behind till the blood ran from his legs. I cut off his ears, nose, slit his mouth from ear to ear, gouged out his eyes. He was dead then. I stuck the knife in his belly and held my mouth to his body and drank his blood.
The court first announced that Fish's execution would take place in April 1935. But not too long after the trial, the verdict and the sentence, Fish tried to commit suicide again with a fishbone while eating his prison meal. Guard Daniel Malone entered Fish's cell on March 29th and discovered that the condemned man had made 2 deep incisions in his abdomen in the shape of a cross. Deep and gory, but not judged fatal, the prison staff removed him from the prison to the hospital for treatment. When Fish arrived at the prison hospital and the doctors ordered an x-ray, they discovered that Fish had 27 sewing needles lodged in his abdomen. Although Fish's execution was to take place in April of 1935, the usual legal maneuvers postponed the execution until, finally, January 13th, 1936. Authorities demonstrated some apprehension as to electrocuting the child murderer when they drew concern from the needles that were lodged in his abdomen. The executioner, a licensed electrician, deemed the needles in Fish's body to be of no import. On January 13th, 1936, Albert H. Fish and another man were to be executed at midnight. Prior to his execution, Fish had roasted chicken for his last meal. Correctional officers walked the condemned child killer to the execution chamber and placed him in the chair. After securing the electrodes firmly on Fish's ankles and head, executioner Robert Elliott threw the switch. Albert Fish died shortly after midnight. The next day, when newspaper reporters asked Fish's defense counsel, James Dempsey, if his client had any last words, the attorney stated that Fish wrote a letter to give to him in order to read. The attorney read the letter and determined the contents to be too vulgar in order to ever divulge. On the afternoon of September 20th, 1911, a clear fall day in Midwestern terms, the quiet in a small section of the city of Colorado Springs, Colorado, seemed almost deafening. Miss June Ruth arrived at her sister's house, Mrs. Alice May Burnham, to complete some sewing. At that point in time, people still left their doors unlocked, and Miss Ruth knew she would have no difficulty entering the house. But before opening the door, though, she noticed the pungent smell of decay permeating the porch of the house. When Miss Ruth walked into the house, the smell sickened her, and when she went to look for her sister, she opened the door to the main bedroom, and that's when she made the horrible discovery. There she noticed, as one newspaper reported, quote, the mangled bodies of her sister, niece, and nephew, their heads crushed to a pulp, lying on the bed covered in blood-soaked sheets, end quote. Miss Ruth immediately ran into the street, raising the alarm. But these were not the only victims. Neighbors ran to the Burnham residence as soon as they heard the news and went to notify the Burnham's neighbors, the Waynes. When citizens entered the Wayne residence, the same smell of decaying flesh strongly penetrated the nostrils of those inquiring into the house. Mr. Henry F. Wayne and Miss Blanche Wayne and their 1-year-old child lay sprawled on the couple's bed, their skulls crushed where facial bones had caved in to the point of unrecognizability. Investigators at the scene surmised that the killer made his entrance through the back door of each house in a methodical manner and murdered the families as they slept. In addition to destroying the skulls of his victims, authorities also determined that the perpetrator used the blade of the instrument to cut the shoulders and other parts of the body as well. One observer noted, quote, "Wayne's head was battered and cut to pieces. The skull of the infant baby was crushed like an eggshell," end quote. After completing the slaughter, the killer covered the bodies with bloody clothing, then left the axe, bloodied and covered with brain matter, near the outside of the back door. The axe belonged to a neighbor, J.R. Evans, and Mrs. Burnham borrowed the axe the week before. When Mrs. Evans went to retrieve the axe on Monday morning, she noticed the blood stains all over the blade, but she thought nothing of it, thinking that Mrs. Burnham used the axe to cut the heads off chickens. The murder of the Burnhams and the Waynes left the police stumped. As meticulously as they combed the crime scene, the killer left no clue as to his identity, except a bloody handprint left on some curtains. Police also noticed that the intruder turned over a bottle of ink and gripped the axe with ink-soaked hands. However, the handprints were smeared and illegible enough for a fingerprint analysis. Fingerprinting became the mainstay for identifying criminals after it was accepted as a legitimate crime-fighting tool in 1910. But any other evidence the police determined was useless. Police immediately thought of Arthur J. Burnham, Mrs. Burnham's husband, as the culprit, as he was the only occupant of the house who escaped injury due to his absence. Arthur J. Burnham worked at a local sanitarium as a cook and had not been home for the last 2 weeks. Police picked him up for questioning and noticed that the tops of his shoes contained spots of what appeared to be blood. Investigators stated that they would make an analysis to see if the stains were really blood or some other substance. Police later released him when his supervisor and security officers at the institution confirmed his alibi. Authorities still believed that Burnham had something to do with the murders, and they suspected that the cook believed his wife to be having an affair with an Italian in the area, and, in a homicidal rage, murdered everyone he could find within the close proximity to his house. Detectives questioning the husband intimated that a man named Donatell visited Mrs. Burnham frequently and that she would soon give birth. How soon was never determined. Mr. Burnham stated that before he and Alice were married, Donatell was her suitor, and after the wedding, he became a trusted friend of the family. Finally, Burnham became enraged with his interrogators and bellowed, quote, "You are barking up the wrong tree. Stop wasting time on me and get the fellow who did this," end quote. On September 23rd, authorities released Burnham from jail. As the investigation into the Burnham and Wayne murders progressed, over 900 miles to the west, on October 2, 1911, a small number of a church congregation at the First Presbyterian Church in Monmouth, Illinois, noticed that their custodian had not been to work in a few days and decided to pay the absentee worker a visit to discover whether he was sick. When the church members arrived at the custodian's residence, they knocked but received no answer. When they went to the rear door, they found it unlocked. As the visitors went into the bedroom, they discovered the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. William Dawson, and in the adjoining room, the body of their 13-year-old daughter, Georgia. It appeared that each victim suffered from a single blow to the head, shattering their skulls. Each body was also wrapped neatly in a sheet, and the house appeared to be undisturbed. Authorities quickly ruled out robbery as a motive, as Dawson still had $40 in his pockets. When questioned, neighbors stated they heard no commotion whatsoever coming from the Dawsons' abode the night before. Since police ruled out robbery as a motive, they looked to the past of one of the victims in order to make sense of the slaughter. Investigators learned that Mr. Dawson had served time in prison for a lesser term due to his turning state's evidence against an accomplice, Chris Marzik. After serving his sentence in Joliet State Prison, Dawson reformed his life, met a woman, fell in love, and the two had a child. Dawson gave no indication that he reverted to his old ways, but when he left the prison, Marzik stated that he would get even, somehow. Police believed the accomplice to be the suspect they were looking for. Authorities resorted to summoning bloodhounds to the area to see if they would be able to catch the scent of the murderer. In addition to the canines, detectives from all over the area met in Monmouth to join the investigation. In order to aid the detectives and the bloodhounds, Governor of Illinois Samuel Deneen offered a $200 reward for information leading to the apprehension and capture of the person or persons responsible for the murder of the Dawson family, or information leading to the capture of, quote, the maniac, end quote, responsible for the deaths of the previous victims, including the Dawsons. Up to this point, the Midwestern Axman had already claimed 14 lives. On October 19, 1911, 533 miles away from Monmouth, Illinois, in Ellsworth, Kansas, Mrs. O.W. Snooks telephoned her neighbor several times and received no answer. After finishing her housework later in the day, Mrs. Snooks went to the Showman house again and discovered the door unlocked and walked in and found William and Pauline Showman and their 2-year-old son, Fenton, dead with their heads beaten in with an axe. Their heads were so disfigured that unless someone knew the family, they would not be able to identify the three. Within the same room, in another bed, Snooks discovered the rest of the family: Lester, 6 years old, and a 4-year-old girl, Fern. Fenton was laying across the dead body of his father, with the head of one of the other children mangled more than the rest of the 5. Authorities believe the murders took place between 12 and 3 o'clock on the Monday morning of October 16th, although they were hesitant to pinpoint the time exactly. George Showman, Will's brother, came to the house on Monday morning at approximately 7 a.m. to bring some milk to the household. He noticed nothing unusual. J.D. Johnson, a co-worker of Showman at the garage where he worked, drove up in front of the house and honked the horn, but received no response. So he drove off rather than waiting. When police searched the Showman household, they noticed an axe sitting behind the door that appeared to have been recently washed. Small stains of blood appeared on the handle. When investigators held up the axe to the light, they noticed several small pieces of curly hair. The sheriff of Ellsworth notified Abilene, Kansas, and requested the use of the bloodhounds, and they arrived later that day of the 19th. When the canines arrived, the first one used took a scent from a piece of cloth that the murderer allegedly wiped his hands after committing the murders. The dog followed a trail as far as the junction where the Frisco and Pacific Railroad tracks merged, then abruptly stopped. The police then brought this dog back to the crime scene and gave the search to the second dog. This dog took the same route and halted at the same spot. Police believe that the assailant walked from the crime scene to the crossing and caught the southbound train between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. Police also believe that Chris Marzik may have been responsible for this attack as well. It would appear that Marzik was the brother-in-law of Mrs. Pauline Showman. At the time of Marzik's incarceration, he and Mrs. Showman's sister experienced difficulties and his wife divorced him, marrying another man. It is said that Marzik stated, as reported earlier, he vowed to get even with not only the Dawsons, but also threatened to get even with his ex-wife's family. An alarm rose when it was reported that Marzik was spotted in Ellsworth just 24 hours before the murders, with the police having been alerted that he was a suspect in the Dawson murders. What investigators failed to clarify was whether authorities suspected Marzik in the Burnham and Wayne murders as well. One of the witnesses who testified against Marzik at his trial for theft that sent him to the penitentiary, Marshall Merritt, stated that someone tried to break into his home and he strongly believed that Marzik the culprit. Investigators discovered that someone took a screen from a window at the Merritt residence, but then made no further effort to enter the residence. Harry Baker, the clerk at a local hotel, stated to police that a man matching the description of Marzik checked into the hotel under the name of, quote, John Smith, end quote, and stated that the man secured employment with a local mining operation. Baker also reported that he found a bloody shirt in the man's room after the murders had been committed and after the mysterious John Smith disappeared. As it turns out, a man named John Smith inquired about working at one of the mines, was offered work, but failed to return to start his employment. In order to expedite the apprehension and capture of the fiend responsible for the Showman murder, the County Commissioner Board offered $500, and Governor Walter R. Stubbs also offered another $500 to find the killer. A theory emerged regarding the Showman murders, as the axe killings in Monmouth and Colorado Springs were somehow connected. This was the first time in the history of the investigation that authorities believed an actual, quote, serial killer, end quote, may have been at work. As the investigation into the Burnham, Wayne, and Dawson murders progressed, on June 6, 1912, in a small yellow house that stood at 710 West Wea Street in Paola, Iowa, two neighbors of the Rollin Hudson family, Mrs. Sherman Stump and Mrs. C.J. Music, noticed that the house seemed unusually quiet. The two women walked around the wraparound porch that adorned the quaint little abode, peering into windows to see if they could notice any movement within the residence. As they stood before the drawn curtains of the bedroom, the two women called out to the family through the window. A third woman, hearing the other two neighbors yelling into the house, walked into the yard and pushed open the unlocked front door. As quickly as she opened the door and walked in, she closed the door brusquely behind her, slowly walked into the front yard, and fainted. The original two women who first investigated the Hudson house hailed down a man, Herman Hintz, traveling in a buggy past the house and coerced him to go into the Hudson residence. Hintz walked in slowly after walking through the door, the three women still standing outside. Hintz walked out after a few minutes, and his face was ashen. He cried out to the women, quote, "My God, they've been murdered," end quote. Hintz then ran up the street. Within no time, the citizens of Paola heard about the murders and began to gather around the Hudson residence. When authorities arrived a short time later, they determined that the Hudsons had been killed with a coal pick that investigators believed the assailant stole from a local rail yard. Investigators also determined that the perpetrator crushed the skulls of the victims with the instrument that they discovered. Mr. Hudson's skull was crushed so intensely that he was not recognizable, quote, "the left side of the skull being torn away and a dozen other blows having rendered his head nothing but a bloody mass," end quote. Mrs. Hudson suffered from a blow to the left temple that tapered and caused death instantly. She also sustained gashes across the forehead, over the right eye, over the left eye that angled downward, that gouged out her eye. After the killer covered their bodies with a comforter, he then proceeded to bring down more strokes upon the dead couple's corpses. Investigators also deduced that the person that visited the Hudsons on Wednesday night before their bodies were discovered was well known to the family, as a meal had been prepared and photo albums opened and displayed. When police further investigated into the relations between the couple, one witness told them of a letter that Mrs. Hudson had received that she seemed, quote, breathless to open, end quote. When the couple went to visit the cemetery later that day, they quarreled viciously. A few hours afterwards, Mr. Hudson left a message for Mrs. Hudson that read, quote, "Well, I'm going to KC. Leave my clothes and those two pictures with Charlie. I will be back next fall and get them. You will not be bothered with me anymore. Goodbye. Rollin," end quote. The killer left no clue as to his identity, with the exception of something witnessed by one of the neighbors on the night that the murder allegedly took place. Mrs. Joseph Longmire stated a lamp hitting the floor of her small house awoke her from a dead sleep at approximately 12:05 a.m., and when she got out of bed, she spotted a dark figure running out of the back door of her house. Mrs. Longmire's 8-year-old daughter stated she witnessed a dark figure looking over the edge of her mother's bed at the time in question. Interestingly, a kimono belonging to Mrs. Hudson was found in the Longmire's dining room. The police took the evidence into custody. The Hudsons were last seen alive on the evening of Wednesday, June 5, 1912, by their neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. William Pryor, when both were seated on the couple's front porch. Mr. Pryor later told police that he witnessed a strange man in a dark suit walk onto the porch. Mr. Hudson then let the stranger into his home. Mrs. Pryor added that she did not notice whether the stranger left the Hudson house when she retired for the evening at approximately 10 p.m. In investigating the victims, police discovered that although the Hudsons had only been married for the previous 2 years, They experienced severe difficulties within their marriage, having been separated 3 times. When investigators uncovered this fact, they theorized that another man may have been involved with the murders of the Hudson family. With the series of crimes that took place over the last year, authorities formulated several theories as to the identity of the killer. The theory that seemed to gain the most traction was that the killer followed some sort of religious mission, punishing those he believed not worthy of living in God's world, or perhaps someone who did not deserve to live based upon their moral behavior. The reason police believed this to be the strongest suspect was that the murders held some similarities, and it appeared the signature of the killer matched substantially. Additionally, most of the victims attended church regularly. On the morning of Sunday, June 9, 1912, Ina and Lena Stillinger, the daughters of Joseph and Sarah Stillinger, left their home to attend church at the Villisca, Iowa Presbyterian Church. Later in the day, the church elders planned a children's program. After the morning service, the girls intended to have dinner with their grandmother, then attending the children's program at the church after services, then returning to their grandmother's to spend the night. However, one of their school friends, Catherine Moore, asked the girls if they would be able to spend the night. The girls received permission from their parents, and after the evening program, returned to the Moore household. Josiah B. Moore lived there with his wife and their 4 children: Herman, aged 11, Catherine, aged 9, Boyd, aged 7, and Paul, aged 5. The family returned from church at approximately 9:45 p.m. on the night of June 9th. On the following morning, Mrs. Mary Peckham, the neighbor of the Moores, awoke at approximately 4:30 on the morning of the 10th and went outside to complete her chore of hanging clothes on the line to dry between 5 and 6 a.m. Mrs. Peckham remembered that she saw the family leave for church the night before, but she went to sleep sometime around 8 p.m. and did not remember seeing them return home, and heard no noises coming from the house the night before. When Mrs. Peckham saw no sign of activity coming from the Moore residence, she walked over to their porch and attempted to wake the family. After this unsuccessful effort, Mrs. Peckham then went to the chicken coop and let the chickens out and checked on the other livestock. Mrs. Peckham then called the home of Ross Moore, Josiah's brother, to determine whether there were any problems with the family that would keep them from being in their home. Mrs. Peckham spoke with Jessie, Ross's wife, and Jessie stated that she would pass the information along to her husband. Later that morning, Mrs. Peckham witnessed Ed Selly, one of Mr. Moore's employees, visit the house to look after the livestock in the barn. After Selly completed that task, Ross Moore arrived with a key to get into the house. Mrs. Peckham stayed on the porch when Ross arrived at the house. At first, he tried looking in the window to see if he could notice any movement within the residence. Ross then entered the house and walked to the downstairs bedroom. To his horror, Ross opened the door to the bedroom and found 2 bodies covered with blood-stained sheets. Ross notified Mrs. Peckham to fetch the sheriff. When police and investigators arrived shortly thereafter, in the downstairs bedroom, they found the Stillinger sisters' heads crushed and horrendously mutilated. In the upstairs bedroom, investigators located Mr. and Mrs. Moore, their heads in a similar fashion as the Stillinger girls, with, quote, their heads crushed and almost severed from their necks, end quote. In an adjoining room, Catherine and Paul lay, their heads crushed as well. And still in another room, Herman and Lloyd, their craniums in the same condition as the other victims in the household. In the middle of the room containing the battered bodies of Herman and Floyd, authorities found an axe believed to be the only weapon used by the assailant who committed this unholy slaughter. From the appearance of the wounds on all of the bodies, it appeared that the perpetrator struck the victims as they slept with the sharp end of the axe first, then finishing his work with the blunt end of the instrument. Robbery was not the intended motive due to the undisturbed fashion in which he left the house. What perplexed investigators even further is that the killer must have had a key to the residence, as the door was locked from the outside. When asked as to whether Josiah J.B. Moore had any enemies, family members responded no. J.B. was a respected businessman in the community. Montgomery County, where the murders were committed, offered a reward of $500 and the state of Iowa offered an additional award of $300 for the apprehension and prosecution of the person or persons responsible for the Villisca murders. Again, bloodhounds from a neighboring county were brought in, but to no avail. They lost the trail of the scent at the Nottoway River. The Midwest remained quiet for a time, and then, on September 27, 1912, the Midwestern Axman struck again. In Payson, Illinois, approximately 97 miles from Springfield, Illinois, and 16 miles outside of Quincy, Illinois, was located the farm of Charles Pfanschmidt. Authorities had been called out when Pfanschmidt didn't answer his door, and it appeared that a small fire had engulfed part of the farm. When police finally entered the scene, they found Charles Pfanschmidt, his wife, their 16-year-old daughter Blanche, and a lady later identified as Miss Emma Campen, a teacher and a friend of Miss Pfanschmidt, who had been visiting the family that evening, all dead. Unlike the other attacks, the perpetrator attempted to burn the house to conceal his crime. The Pfanschmidts received various wounds about the head and their bodies were burned, but not bad enough in 2 of the cases to exclude an identification. Upon examining the crime scene, investigators learned that the Pfanschmidts retired to bed early. The telephone lines appeared to have been cut, and the relatives of Miss Campen were unable to establish a telephone connection with which to speak to her. When the local sheriff requested bloodhounds, as in the previous cases, something interesting occurred. The bloodhounds led the authorities to Ray Pfanschmidt, Charles's son. Ray worked at a camp just outside Payson, Illinois, and the dogs led right to him. However, authorities did not believe the evidence strong enough to warrant an arrest. Authorities reevaluated the murder scene and ascertained that the assailant attempted to dismember the bodies and burn them in the stove. This is what caused the fire, but it did not engulf the entire cabin. It would appear that another long hiatus may occur and the killer's elusive behavior would keep him from detection. But while the investigations in the wheat belt continued, another crime near Columbia, Missouri could provide a valuable link to all of the cases. On or about December 18, 1912, police responded to a call from the residence of Mrs. Georgia Moore and Mrs. Mary J. Wilson. Henry Lee Moore, Mrs. Moore's son, arrived at the home sometime around 3:45 p.m. after returning home to celebrate Christmas with his mother and grandmother. Moore tried the front door, but it was locked. He went around to the different windows to see if he could peer into them. After unsuccessfully attempting to enter, Moore went to the house of a neighbor of the 2 ladies named Mrs. Samuel Cornelson. When asked whether all the doors were locked, Mrs. Cornelson stated she had no idea why the house had been locked up so. Moore then went back to the house and tried the back door. He pushed it open, and when he finally walked into the house, he witnessed his mother lying on her back with a large cut from an axe across her forehead and her throat cut, quote, presumably with a knife, end quote. Moore dashed from the house without going any further inward and back to Mrs. Cornelson's residence and informed her that his mother had been murdered. The alarm sounded so that all the neighbors in the vicinity would contact the local authorities. When the police arrived, they found Mrs. Moore and then searched the premises for Mrs. Wilson. They found Mrs. Wilson lying on the bed in a pool of blood. On closer examination, Mrs. Wilson sustained a deep gash on the right side of her neck. The blow appeared to have cut off the lower part of her ear. This appeared to be the only blow she sustained. Her right hand was folded under her face, and her left hand was resting just beneath her chin. The angle of the cut demonstrated that the killer stood in front of the bed when he struck her. As far as Mrs. Moore, the position of the axe cut on her forehead indicated that, quote, this was made after she was on the floor, end quote. Police discounted robbery as the motive. After a coroner's inquest was held, authorities arrested Henry Lee Moore for the murders. After an in-depth investigation into the background of Henry Lee Moore, investigators discovered that Moore had been in prison for until as recently as May 1911, having been convicted of forgery. Prior to leaving prison, Moore wrote a letter to a 16-year-old girl named Queenie Nichols, where he professed his undying love for the teenager. Nichols rejected Moore outright, stating that he, quote, had no home of his own, end quote. Moore then told Nichols he would soon have his mother's house. He did not clarify how this would happen. During a subsequent interrogation, Moore stated that he finished college and received a degree from Kansas State Agricultural College 6 years prior to the murders, and traveled extensively through China and South America. When first questioned by the police, Moore gave conflicting statements as to why he appeared in Columbia, Missouri. In later discussions, Moore stated that once he arrived in Columbia, he registered at a local hotel under the name of, quote, L. Smith, end quote. He did this in an attempt to keep his mother from realizing he had come to town. Moore averred that he went to his room, then grabbed some dinner, returning to his room around 6 p.m. the night before the murder, and stayed there until the next morning. The whole time, Moore professed his innocence throughout the questioning. Moore had some small blood droplets on his shirt and explained that he had a nosebleed. Interestingly, Moore kept newspaper clippings of the case of Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen, the London doctor who allegedly poisoned his wife to take up with his mistress. Police also discovered, through his self-admission, that Moore had the habit of visiting morgues wherever he visited for work out of, quote, curiosity. Moore engaged 2 attorneys to assist with his defense, F.C. Finley and Ralph Harris, and they met with their client the afternoon of his arrest. The prosecuting attorney, E.C. Anderson, stated that he possessed enough evidence to convict Moore at the time of his arrest. Anderson's challenge was to prove motive through documentation rather than just the wild rumors circulating throughout the region regarding Moore. After his trial, conviction, sentence, and affirmed appeal, Sheriff Bert Sapp of Columbia, Missouri, brought Moore to the state penitentiary to begin serving his sentence. In May 1913, an astounding theory surfaced that identified Moore as a, quote, serial killer, end quote, even though the term had not yet been coined. M.W. McClary, the warden's son and special agent with the Department of Justice, proclaimed that Henry Lee Moore was responsible for 25 axe murders committed across the Midwestern United States throughout 1911 and 1912. Sometime after Moore's conviction, on a hunch, McClary sent Moore's fingerprints to J.H. Livingston, a fingerprint expert located in Jefferson City, Missouri. Livingston, quote, suggested, end quote, that Moore had something to do with the murders. The media at the time embellished these suspicions to the point that Moore was seriously being considered for the charges of murder in the previous cases, including the Moore family in Villisca, Iowa. McClary's theory was later discredited when the superintendent of the Kansas State Reformatory, M.F. Amrine, stated that he corresponded with Moore at the time of the murders, and Henry was in Columbia, Missouri at the time the series was committed. Back in Villisca, authorities tried the Reverend George Kelly as the only suspect who ever went on trial for the murders. After 2 trials, Kelly was acquitted, although Kelly had a penchant for writing obscene letters to women in an attempt to get them to type in front of him in the nude. Evidence suggested that Reverend Kelly had been in Villisca at the time of the murders, but scant circumstantial evidence failed to convict him.
Villisca authorities questioned many suspects in connection with the J.B. Moore family murders before settling and finally charging Reverend George Kelly with the crime. Other suspects may not have been so strong in their eyes. One series of murders that went unmentioned in detail within this presentation occurred on June 5, 1910, more than a year before the massacre in Colorado Springs, Colorado. In Marshalltown, Iowa, Raymond Hardy, a young strapping farm boy, reported that his parents, James and Lavinia Hardy, and his elder brother, Earl Hardy, had been slaughtered the night before. Ray, as he was known, spent the evening with his fiancee's family, and when he returned home, found his family massacred. At first, authorities suspected Ray as the culprit as his father's land holdings seemed vast. But after investigating his alibi, investigators realized that Ray had nothing to do with the murders. I mention this case not because of the weapon used, a large gas pipe, but the signature of the murders each victim suffered, devastating head wounds, and almost uncontrollable rage demonstrated in the annihilation of the Hardy family. Even though the Hudson family were shown to have been murdered with a coal pick in June of 1912, it is more than certain the maniac wreaking havoc throughout the Midwest committed those murders as well. Therefore, If there was a certified Axman in the Heartland, the Hardy family murders must be included.
On June 28, 1906, at approximately 8 a.m., mourners arrived at a large prominent house located on 21st Street, facing Gramercy Park in New York City. Once mourners arrived, they paid their respects to the prominent man lying in the casket of the parlor of the residence. When the multitudes of people concluded their mourning, a hearse and 4 carriages drew up before the house, and the close relatives and friends mounted the carriages for the journey to his interment. A funeral mass was said at the Little Episcopal Church at St. James, Long Island. After the burial, the mourners dispersed. As the causes of his death remained a mystery, some still had questions in their minds as to why this venerated artist had to die, to be dispatched in public in front of many witnesses. After all, the deceased contributed greatly to the metropolitan landscape of New York City. In fact, he designed the original Madison Square Garden that contained a theater and restaurant on the top floor where influential New Yorkers attended performances and hobnobbed with their class. The murder of Stanford White, architect and humanitarian, raised questions as to the equitable nature of the justice system. But his demise also opened the door to a dark world of perversion, seduction, and period deviance. The central figure in White's death set her sights on becoming an actress and made her way to New York City at the age of 15 in December of 1900. She began as a model in Pennsylvania, where her career seemed to spell bigger and better things. Within a few days of arriving in the city, a renowned local artist, James Carroll Beckwith, saw the young girl and determined that she fit the mold of the, quote, perfectly formed nymph, end quote, and requested that she pose for him twice a week in order for the artist to complete a portrait of the young girl. Soon after posing for Beckwith, the young girl, Evelyn Nesbit, saw her services in great demand as she soon appeared on the covers of postcards and magazines. Nesbit even appeared on Cosmopolitan, Vanity Fair, Harper's Bazaar, and Ladies' Home Journal. Most historians of the period branded Evelyn as the first pin-up girl of the 20th century. Although she had no formal training as an actress, Nesbit won a role in the musical of Florodora in 1901. At one of these performances of the risque musical, Evelyn caught the eye of one of the most influential men in New York City at the time, Stanford White. White acted like a smitten teenager whenever he attended a performance in which Evelyn appeared. What the rest of New York did not know is that White exhibited an almost insatiable appetite for young girls and indiscriminate intercourse with those young girls. White, along with other men his age at the time, formed an organization in 1887 known as the, quote, Sewer Club, end quote, where they brought young women, and sometimes young boys, to a secluded, out-of-the-way place within the city to indulge in their fantasies of whatever suited their fancy. A man as powerful and wealthy as White attracted the most beautiful young girls and boys to the lair of decadence. White's infatuation with Evelyn grew steadily, and the 46-year-old White arranged with another chorus girl who was quite intimate with Evelyn to have the stunning teenager attend a, quote, society luncheon, end quote. It turned out the luncheon to be just a lunch with 4 people held at White's West 24th Street apartment. It was there, after the luncheon, that White introduced Evelyn to the, quote, red velvet swing, end quote, a seemingly harmless device hanging from the ceiling of White's second floor of the apartment. After several prodding suggestions from the middle-aged architect to Evelyn to try the swing, she relented. Over the course of several months, White gained the confidence of Evelyn's mother so that the young girl spent more time with him. When Evelyn first met White, she considered him, quote, terribly old, end quote, but then grew to admire his charming demeanor and what can only be described as his, quote, boundless playfulness. Mrs. Nesbit believed White to be harmless and only wanted to cultivate a paternal relationship with her daughter. Over time, though, Mrs. Nesbit allowed her teenage daughter to attend numerous parties and luncheons where White was the host. White softened the mother with lavish gifts and began calling him, quote, Stanny, end quote, mentioning him to her friends that White became their, quote, benefactor, end quote. Approximately 2 months after solidifying his friendship with Evelyn's mother, White offered to pay all expenses for Mrs. Nesbit to take a trip to her home in Pittsburgh. Evelyn's mother stated she would make the trip on the condition that Evelyn saw no one but White during her absence. While Mrs. Nesbit traveled to Pittsburgh, White sent a cab for Evelyn at the residence where she stayed. Told there would be a cocktail party, when Evelyn arrived at White's apartment, she noticed no other guests there but her. White explained all the other guests declined to attend and they would have to make do with just them two. According to the later account Evelyn rendered, she drank a lot of champagne and passed out. When she awoke, Evelyn laid nude in a bed covered by silk sheets with a canopied mirror. The telltale sign of her deflowering appeared on her inner thigh. White was reported to have given Evelyn a kimono and told her, quote, "Don't cry, kittens. It's all over. Now you belong to me," end quote. For several days after that, Evelyn bounced between anger and confusion, as she could not decipher how a man she respected and admired could have done this to her. In any case, with no other suitors or men willing to take care of her, she stayed with White for some time, and any further appearances on the red velvet swing would entail Evelyn's nudity. White showered the young girl with expensive gifts such as pearl necklaces, 3 diamond rings, and a set of fox furs. In August of 1902, Evelyn met a young sketch artist at one of the lavish parties thrown by White. The artist, John Barrymore, the future celebrated actor, waited until White left New York City for a fishing trip in Canada. Since the architect would be out of town for 2 weeks, Barrymore made his move for Evelyn. When Mrs. Nesbit found out about the budding relationship between her daughter and Barrymore, she notified White almost immediately and implored him to intervene to end the relationship. When White intervened, Evelyn faced animus from 2 different directions and reluctantly agreed to attend a boarding school in New Jersey. After Florodora ran its course, Evelyn won a part in another musical, Wild Irish Rose. After one of her performances in that work, Evelyn received flowers, letters, and offers of large gifts from a man calling himself, quote, Mr. Monroe, end quote. Monroe asked Evelyn to accompany him to dinners and other parties, but she politely declined his advances. The man calling himself Mr. Monroe was, in fact, Harry K. Thaw, the millionaire playboy from Pittsburgh. Thaw sought Evelyn's affections due to his infatuation with the young girl, and also that he hated Stanford White, and the affair between Evelyn and White became public knowledge. Thaw considered White to be a, quote, ravisher of young girls, end quote, and White kept Thaw from joining various clubs in the city. Additionally, Thaw desired more than anything to become Evelyn's, quote, knight in shining armor, end quote, to protect her from the brutish White. Thaw finally arranged a meeting with Evelyn through an intermediary, and according to Evelyn's later accounts, once Thaw finally got his wish, he knelt before Evelyn, kissed the hem of her dress, and stated that Evelyn was the most beautiful girl in the city of New York. Thaw finally revealed that he came from a very wealthy family, but Evelyn sensed something strange with the young man who strived to be her suitor. Thaw pursued Evelyn with a reckless abandon. In 1903, at the end of the term for her boarding school, Evelyn developed appendicitis and needed life-saving surgery. Thaw rushed the young girl to the hospital and held her hand while she was there, professing his love for Evelyn. When she recovered, Evelyn reluctantly agreed to go to Europe with Thaw and his mother, a trip that Evelyn later regretted. In a Paris hotel room, at Thaw's urging after he plied her with a lot of champagne, Evelyn related what White did to her. When Thaw listened to every gory and sordid detail, he, according to Evelyn, quote, shuddered, whimpered, and then went limp, end quote. Thaw kept whispering, quote, oh God, poor child, end quote. Harry K. Thaw was the type of personality that could not let bygones be bygones. and the memory of the woman he now loved being ravaged by an older man who stifled the young man's social standing festered within the young millionaire's mind. Subsequent to Mrs. Thaw leaving the couple in Europe and returning to the United States, Thaw and Evelyn found themselves in a rented castle in Austria. Evelyn described the castle in her memoirs as
a huge Gothic nightmare of cold stones and dimly lit, drafty passageways, grimmer than anything in the Grimm's Brothers' tales. Evelyn Nesbit.
On the first night in the castle, Evelyn fell asleep and was awakened by a naked and seething Thaw. He threw aside the covers and began abusing her with a riding crop. Eventually, Thaw forced Evelyn into a sexual encounter. In the eyes of those who knew the truth, Thaw's behavior mirrored that of White's in this instance. Although Thaw saw himself as Evelyn's sole protector, both men viewed the young girl as a possession to be owned. After this incident, and upon their return to the United States, on April 5, 1906, Evelyn and Harry Thaw were married in a private ceremony in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Evelyn then moved into the Thaw mansion, which could only be described as, quote, large and depressing, end quote, in Pittsburgh. What can only be a bird in a gilded cage, Evelyn lived a life of restricted luxury, resembling a sex slave with no escape. In the spring of 1906, Thaw started arrangements to schedule a European trip for he and Evelyn, and planned to spend a week in New York prior to heading across the Atlantic. The ship was set to sail on June 28th. On June 25, 1906, at approximately 6 p.m., Evelyn left her hotel suite on Fifth Avenue and met her husband at a local bar where they had drinks. Thaw had been there for quite some time and already consumed 3 alcoholic beverages. Thaw paid the $3 tab with a $100 bill, and then the couple headed off to Cafe Martin. As the Thaws enjoyed their dinner, Stanford White walked in with his son. Evelyn stated that a cold chill ran down her spine as he walked past the table. Considering the city heat, true fear embraced the young girl. Harry Thaw did not notice White's presence. Evelyn wrote a small note to Thaw informing him of White's presence. Thaw uncharacteristically did not lose his temper at first. As the couple left the restaurant and Thaw put on a straw hat, he cracked the brim in anger. Thaw then announced that he had tickets to a performance of Mam'selle Champagne at the dinner theater atop Madison Square Garden later that evening. During the performance, Thaw learned that White would be there for the play. Later witnesses remembered once Thaw learned that his nemesis would be there, he, quote, paced the theater's lobby like a caged tiger, end quote. Evelyn realized what would happen if a confrontation ensued between Thaw and White, and very politely asked Thaw if they could leave. Evelyn and Thaw were part of a group of 4 people, and when they got to the elevator before leaving, 3 of them noticed Thaw had slipped away. The next thing the party knew, gunshots rang out. Evelyn knew immediately what happened. Thaw slipped away from his party as they were leaving and made his way to White's table, some 5 rows away from the stage. Thaw produced a revolver and confronted White. From 12 feet away, Thaw fired the first shot, which hit White in the head, killing him instantly. Thaw drew closer to White and fired the last 2 shots from approximately 2 to 3 feet away, striking White again in the head and the left shoulder. Once Thaw fired the last shot, he uttered,
"I did it because he ruined my wife. He had it coming to him. He took advantage of her and deserted her."
After the shooting and Thaw's proclamation, chaos ensued throughout the theater where herds of people made their way to the exits. The stage manager yelled that the show should continue and ordered the band to continue playing. At the moment of the shooting, Evelyn knew her husband had done something horrific. Police officers summoned very quickly arrested Thaw immediately. As they led the murderer away, Evelyn stated to her husband, quote, "Look at the fix you are in," end quote. Thaw replied, quote, "It's all right, dear. I have probably saved your life," end quote. On June 26, 1906, at approximately 3 a.m., authorities charged Harry K. Thaw with the murder of Stanford White and escorted him from the station house across the Bridge of Sighs to the Tombs, the city prison of New York City. In formulating a strategy to prosecute Thaw, New York District Attorney William T. Jerome the combative prosecutor sought to have Thaw deemed insane and sent to an asylum to save the state of New York some money. Thaw's original attorney, Louis Delfield, thought this to be a great idea. Why would a sane man literally execute the alleged abuser of his wife in front of 1,000 witnesses? Thaw would not even consider it and labeled Delfield a traitor. Thaw fired his attorney and hired another attorney. Thaw hoped to be put on the stand at trial and expose what he called, quote, that set of perverts, end quote. In late January of 1907, jury selection began, and on February 4th, 1907, opening statements began in the case of the State of New York versus Harry Kendall Thaw. At the start of the trial, Thaw realized that if he did not plead insanity, he could seriously face the electric chair in the murder of Stanford White. On February 7, 1907, Evelyn Nesbit Thaw took the stand and related the horrible events that transpired after she met Stanford White. On the stand, Evelyn stated,
"He made me swear that I would never tell my mother about it. He said there was no use in talking, and the greatest thing in the world was not to get found out."
Evelyn responded when asked if Thaw got agitated when she related the details of what transpired between her and White.
"Yes, he was excited and walked up and down the room. We sat up all night. He said it was not my fault, that no one could blame me, and that I was only an unfortunate girl, and that he didn't think any less of me. He would marry me anyway."
The defense wanted to admit a letter that Evelyn wrote to Thaw explaining the incidents that occurred between her and White. D.A. Jerome objected, but by the afternoon session, the letter was admitted into evidence, thus substantiating Evelyn's testimony in front of the court. Evelyn also stipulated that White tried to poison her against Thaw and keep her from Thaw's advances. By the middle of February, the gallery heard the grotesque story of a man who made advances and took advantage of a young girl half his age. The defense invoked a supplemental defense to Thaw's actions, entailing an uncodified law known as the, quote, unwritten law, end quote. The unwritten law applied, predominantly, to women who were wronged by their paramours. At the turn of the 20th century, the law was used as a defense of many women who murdered their paramours. If it worked for the women, the defense argued, it can work for Harry K. Thaw. But theoretically, the law only applied when in infidelity situations and not just the smoldering jealousy of a man proven to be abusive as well. During the course of the Thaw trial, the defense demonized the victim, Stanford White, in an attempt to win an acquittal for their client. Finally, in April of 1907, D.M. Delmas, defense attorney for Thaw, made a 2.5-hour closing statement to the case. Delmas appealed to chivalry when he stated, "The man who had brooded on this subject for 3 years, who had pictures of dreadful horrors haunting him by day and in the stillness of the night, could not be human to retain the calmness of reason." Delmas concluded by asking the jurors to put themselves in Thaw's place. Would they have not defended the honor of the woman they loved in such a way? Later in the day of April 12, 1907, the jury deliberated but could not reach a verdict in the case of the State of New York versus Harry K. Thaw. With the announcement of the verdict, Harry Thaw appeared unaffected. Police escorts brought the defendant back to the Tombs, and D.A. Jerome, determined to see Thaw prosecuted, vowed that another trial for the murder of Stanford White would be forthcoming. The second trial occurred in the mid to latter part of January 1908. Thaw's defense attorneys claimed Thaw insane when he committed the murder, diminished capacity. After 25 hours after being given their charges, the jury found Thaw not guilty by diminished capacity. Thaw would later be sentenced to the Mattawan Asylum for the Criminally Insane and would remain there until judged appropriate to return to society. Although Thaw escaped any real justice, the stigma of murderer did not necessarily stain his reputation any. Most believe that Evelyn's testimony at the second trial proved vindicating to her husband. In fact, later in her life, Evelyn admitted that her mother-in-law, Mrs. Thaw, offered Evelyn a divorce and $1 million if she testified at the second trial that Stanford White raped her. Evelyn eventually got her divorce, but the $1 million never materialized. Thaw stayed at the Mattawan until 1913, when another court determined him sane. Upon his release, Thaw went to Canada, but authorities extradited him back to the United States. Another sanity trial found him sane in 1915. Thaw's life continued without much incident until 1916. Thaw invited a young boy by the name of Frederick G. Gump Jr. to New York to act as Thaw's protege. The young man traveled from Kansas City, Missouri to New York in order to take the opportunity. A period newspaper described the young man as, quote, "He was physically a perfect specimen of strong young manhood," end quote. Gump's description of the harrowing incident incited many regarding the cruelty Thaw exhibited toward the young man. Once Thaw locked the boy in a suite at the McAlpin Hotel in New York City, Thaw began the evening with some small conversation that seemed to impress Gump. Gump then retired to take a bath. Thaw peeked into the bathroom twice while the young man bathed. On the third time, Gump stood up in the tub and Thaw grabbed the boy's hand and yanked him into the hotel room. Thaw beat the young man with a series of whips, and Gump fought him for over an hour to get the older man to stop. As the boy struggled, Thaw continued to beat the boy. When Gump lost the strength to resist Thaw's beating, Gump begged Thaw to stop. Thaw then replied, quote, "Not until you are my slave," end quote. The subsequent rendition of the events of what happened sickened many people. Eventually, after a horrific night of abuse, Gump escaped the hotel room. A later physical examination of the young boy revealed the extent of the abuse. At the trial for this offense, the jury found Thaw insane and sentenced him, again, to an insane asylum. Authorities released Thaw after he spent 7 years in the facility. He died in 1947 from a heart attack and is buried in the Allegheny Cemetery of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Evelyn Nesbit later went on to marry a dance instructor, Jack Clifford, who left her in 1918 but did not divorce her until 1933. Later in Evelyn's life, approximately 6 years after the second trial, Evelyn sought spousal support for her 6-year-old son that she claimed Thaw as the father. What she didn't rely on was that someone came forward and claimed paternity at the time. Therefore, any claim that Evelyn may have had on the Thaw fortune dried up with the father's admission. In 1955, Hollywood made a movie about Evelyn entitled The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing. The producers took a great deal of license to produce a viewership. Joan Collins played the lead role, with Farley Granger as Thaw and Ray Milland as the older Stanford White. Evelyn Nesbit died in a nursing home in Santa Monica, California on January 17, 1967, at the age of 82. As the United States entered the war in Europe, the citizens of the country waved goodbye to sons, husbands, and loved ones on their way to the Western Front to, quote, fight for democracy, end quote. The life in the Big Easy of New Orleans seemed a welcome distraction from the war. But among the nighttime shadows of the city, a killer surfaced who demanded appeasement from the residents of that city. This killer proved dastardly, diabolical, sociopathic, and psychotic. He held the city hostage for over 18 months, but those who tried to catch him never realized that his crimes may have gone back more than 8 years before. The dark days of the Axman still generate a morbid fascination with the macabre and foment fear amongst the locals who first hear of the reign of terror of this serial killer for the first time. The world would continue to see the brutality of such attacks, and even worse, as the allure of serial murder would permeate the human psyche. The most popular historical acceptance of the beginning of the Axeman occurred at approximately 4:30 a.m. on the morning of May 23, 1918. A low moaning sound roused Jacob Maggio from his sound sleep. When Jake arose from his bed, he awoke his other brother, Andrew, from a drunken stupor where he was celebrating being called into the service of his country. Jake and Andrew stumbled through the house located at 4901 Magnolia Street in Midtown New Orleans, and when they opened the door to the room that their brother Joseph shared with his wife Catherine, the two men shrieked in horror. Catherine and Joseph lay in a pool of blood on the bed. Catherine lay groaning with a large gash on the side of her head. Joseph, with the same wounds, lay dead. Jake and Andrew immediately called for the police and an ambulance to assist with Mrs. Maggio, but she later died of her wounds. Captain John Drum was the first watch commander to arrive on the scene and noticed that an empty strongbox lay opened on the floor. Captain Drum surmised that the Maggios had been victims of a robbery gone badly. Captain Drum also noticed that one of the bottom panels of the back door adjacent to the Maggios' bedroom had been chiseled out. Captain Drum further surmised that more witnesses should have come forward due to the loud banging it would have taken to loosen the panel to break into the house. Dr. Joseph O'Hara, the coroner for Orleans Parish, determined that the Maggios succumbed to, quote, external and internal hemorrhages of the head and brain, end quote. Additionally, it appeared that both victims suffered from their throats being cut with a razor. Later that day, two New Orleans detectives, Theodore Obitz and Harry Dodson, stumbled across a chalk message in the sidewalk near the murder scene. The cryptic writing stated, quote, Mrs. Maggio is going to sit up late tonight just like Miss Tony, end quote. The message did not appear to make sense to either of the gumshoes, but they copied down the exact wording anyway. Andrew and Jake Maggio were arrested and brought to the 7th District Police Station for questioning. Despite being hungover and barely coherent, Andrew Maggio withstood the incessant questioning from police after they discovered the razor used to slice the throats of Joseph and Catherine belonged to the slowly sobering Andrew. The police later released the two brothers, but a rumor circulated throughout the city that the mafia was involved in the Maggio murder. Subsequently, authorities learned that something more diabolical was afoot. On the morning of June 28, 1918, a baker by the name of John Zanka walked up to the door of Dorgenois and La Harpe Streets, where he was to make a delivery at the grocery store run by Louis Bessemer. When Zanka received no response from his knocking on the front door, he went to the side alley to try that entranceway. Zanka noticed in the dimly lit alley that one of the panels at the bottom of the door appeared missing. Zanka prepared to knock again when suddenly Louis Bessemer answered the door with blood running down his face from a gash in his head. Bessemer claimed that the, quote, Axman, end quote, had visited he and his mistress, Harriet Lowe, in the middle of the night and wounded her badly as well. When police arrived, they noticed a pool of blood, but no Harriet. She received her wounds at one spot and then dragged herself to the bedroom where she lay unconscious. In the bathroom, the police discovered a bloody axe leaning against one of the walls of the tub. Diluted blood and water stood at the bottom of the tub. On the following day, authorities chose to approach the Bessemer case with a slight difference from the Maggios. While looking for clues to the attack on Bessemer and Lowe, the police discovered letters Bessemer had written in German and Yiddish. Authorities deduced that Bessemer was a German spy and therefore asked for the assistance from federal authorities. The Bessemer attack proved to be a, quote, red herring, end quote, and had nothing to do with the Axeman whatsoever. Louis Bessemer even requested that he be allowed to investigate his own case. Mrs. Lowe recovered, and it turned out to be just a lover's quarrel that turned violent. Because detectives advocated that the Bessemer case had Axeman signatures, Police Superintendent Frank Mooney demoted 2 detectives. The city remained free from any nocturnal attacks, at least until August 5th. Mrs. Edward Schneider lay in her bed resting on that muggy August night. Her husband worked nights and left her alone with their 3 children while he performed his job duties. As she lay on the bed, 9 months pregnant, her 3 children slept in the next room. When she opened her eyes briefly, she noticed a dark figure standing over her. The figure then struck her with something in the face, knocking out 2 front teeth and rendering her unconscious. Once the police brought her to Charity Hospital, Mrs. Schneider regained consciousness and became hysterical, believing that she would lose her baby. The trauma of the attack caused her to go into labor. When the child was born, there were no effects from the attack, and both baby and mother recovered from the excitement. After an extensive search of the house, detectives discovered the axe missing from the family's tool shed. 5 days later, police were called to the residence of another grocer, Joseph Romano. When they arrived, the authorities found the lifeless and bloodied body of the grocer barber. The police found no evidence suggesting the identity of the perpetrator, but 2 witnesses, Pauline, aged 18, and her sister Mary, aged 13, lay in bed trying to sleep and heard nothing of the attack on their uncle. Pauline stated that she awoke at approximately 3 a.m. and saw what she thought to be the shadow of a tall man standing near her door. Just then, her uncle, Mr. Romano, stumbled into the girl's room and appeared to be dazed with blood running from a deep wound in the scalp. Romano then went into the next room and slumped into the chair where he stated, "Something has happened. My head hurts. Call for an ambulance." The Axeman had attacked 2 families and left 3 dead in his wake. Police tried desperately to determine what type of individual could have been responsible for the terror. Detective John D'Antonio, an experienced investigator who worked the Walter Lamanna murder case some 11 years before, sought to identify the characteristics of the killer in an interview to the local newspapers.
"I am convinced the man is of a dual personality, and it is very probable he is the man we tried so hard to get 10 years ago, when a series of axe and butcher knife murders was committed within a few months. My opinion is based on experience and a study of criminology. Criminals such as the ones like the Axeman are on the order of Jack the Ripper, who some years ago terrorized London. They are cunning and hard to catch. I've never known the mafia to kill women. In fact, you could not get a mafia agent to murder a woman under any circumstances."
The attacks that Detective D'Antonio referenced occurred between 1910 and 1917. In the early morning hours of August 14, 1910, Mr. August Crudy and his wife settled in for the night in the apartment above their grocery store located at the corner of Lesseps and Royal Streets. Crudy often suffered from an upset stomach, and in the early morning hours of the 14th, Crudy awoke after laying down for approximately a half an hour. Crudy got out of bed and walked to the backyard of the residence in the hopes that the night air would relieve his discomfort. He returned to bed next to his wife and fell asleep at approximately 1 a.m. At approximately 3 a.m., Mrs. Crudy awoke to find a large dark figure standing next to her bed holding what appeared to be a meat cleaver. The figure demanded money, and Mrs. Crudy obliged the demand. When Mrs. Crudy asked for her husband, she then shook August, and when he turned over, bled from massive gashes in his head. When August tried to raise himself up from the bed, the assailant struck him again with the cleaver, and Mr. Crudy fell off the bed with the force of the blow. The attacker soon fled after the strike. Surprisingly, August Crudy recovered from his wounds, but never forgot the actions from that night. Police had no leads as to the mysterious assailant. 5 weeks later, on September 21, 1910, Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Rosetto, who owned a grocery store at the corner of London and Tonti Avenues, suffered a brutal attack by a mysterious stranger, and once authorities made it to the crime scene, they feared the Rosettos would not survive. Fortunately, the Rosettos did survive the attack and would later reunite in the hospital. Again, the police had no leads or suspects. For over a year, the city remained quiet regarding the phantom assailant. Then on September 21, 1911, Joseph Davy and his wife were attacked while they slept in the small apartment they owned behind their grocery store at 2425 Galvez Street. The first blow struck Mr. Davy over the head and fractured his skull. Mrs. Davy received deep cuts on her nose and hands. Mr. Davy succumbed to his wounds, and Mrs. Davy stated that, quote, she would devote the balance of her life to find the murderer or murderers of her husband, end quote. Even averring to find the killers, Mrs. Davy could not identify the assailant or assailants that killed her husband. The killer remained silent for 8 months, and then, on May 12, 1912, Corporal George Duffy of the 5th Precinct received a telephone call from a Fred Stegelmeyer who resided at 4212 Villeray Street. Stegelmeyer claimed to the young officer that he heard gunshots coming from a barroom owned by Anthony J. Chambra and his wife, Johanna, at the corner of France and Villeray Streets. Corporal Duffy proceeded to the Chambra residence, and when he opened the door to the residence behind the barroom, he found Anthony Chambra nude with gunshot wounds to the back. His wife, Johanna, lay unconscious from a gunshot wound to the hip. Corporal Duffy tried to question Miss Chambra when she could barely sustain consciousness, but she could not identify the assailant. Anthony Chambra died at the scene. Mrs. Chambra died from her wound a few days later. Almost 5 years later, on Saturday morning, December 22, 1917, Epitome Andolina and his 2 sons, John and Salvador, suffered from wounds they sustained during a hatchet attack at their residence and place of business at 8301 Apple Street. Mrs. Andolina first saw the intruder and gave the alarm with a loud scream, alerting the others to the presence of a stranger standing near the foot of her bed. The assailant struck Mr. Andolina in the head, and when his sons intervened, they received wounds as well. The intruder then escaped. No one could give a credible description of the assailant. When Antonio reminded the populace of the city of the previous murders and attacks, Superintendent of Police Frank Mooney began in earnest to find the killer. He studied the previous cases and noticed that the killings escalated in the ferocity. With no other leads to follow, the police had nothing to do but wait until another attack occurred. This would never be more certain. In an effort to allay the fears of the residents of New Orleans, on August 19, 1918, a local supermarket used the murders to advertise specials at their store. Although indeed in bad taste, the newspaper advertisement displayed the morbid sense of humor used as a coping mechanism by the citizens of the city. The new year passed without much fanfare, but on March 9, 1919, the Axman struck again. On the west bank of the Mississippi River is the small hamlet known as Gretna. Charles Cortimiglia normally opened his grocery store at the corner of Jefferson and 2nd Streets early in the morning. Hazel Jackson, a neighbor of the Cortimiglia family, tried to get someone to answer the door, but to no avail. Jackson then went to the side alley and knocked on the door there. Jackson noticed that a chair was under the bedroom window where Mr. and Mrs. Cortimiglia slept. Jackson also noticed that the back door had one of its panels missing. She ran from the house and then immediately notified the police. When authorities arrived at the Cortimiglia residence, they found the lifeless body of 2-year-old Mary Cortimiglia. Mr. and Mrs. Cortimiglia had been attacked after their little girl, but they clung to life. Mrs. Cortimiglia cried uncontrollably for her deceased child. When police located the bloody axe used on the Cortimiglias under the front steps of their house, little clumps of hair and brain were discovered on the blade. While in the hospital, Mrs. Cortimiglia identified 17-year-old neighbor Orlando Gugliardo Jr. as her assailant. Gugliardo's father, Orlando Gugliardo Sr., was also identified as an accomplice. Mrs. Cortimiglia used to work for Mr. Gugliardo and left his employ to start a business of her own across the street. Mrs. Cortimiglia convinced her husband to start another business in order to put the Gugliardos out of business. Subsequently, the 2 men stood trial and were found guilty. But later, Mrs. Cortimiglia had an epiphany and decided to tell the truth about the Gugliardos, recanting her accusations against the father and the son. They were immediately released and the charges against them dropped. Superintendent Mooney gave a candid interview to the local media where he expressed his beliefs as to the character of the murderer. As these axe murders have grown in number, I've been forced to the belief that they are the work of a madman. I am convinced that the murders are the work of an axe-wielding degenerate who has no robbery motive, but who has taken small sums to throw the police off the track. I further believe he is a sadist, and he crawls through the panel of the door. After going into the house, he opens the door. To add further mystique to the identity of the killer, on March 16, 1919, the local newspaper, the Times-Picayune, received a cryptic letter that appeared to taunt the police. The letter read in its entirety,
Help! March 13th, 1919. Esteemed mortal of New Orleans, they have never caught me and they never will. They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell. I am what you Orleanians and your foolish police call the Axman of Notre Dame. When I see fit, I shall come and claim other victims. I alone know who they'll be. I shall leave no clue except my bloody axe be smeared with blood and brains of he who I have sent below to keep me company. If you wish, you may tell the police to be careful and not to rustle my jimmies. Of course, I am a reasonable spirit. I take no offense at the way they have conducted their investigations in the past. In fact, they have been so utterly stupid as to not only amuse me, but His Satanic Majesty, Franz Joseph, etc. But tell them to beware. Let them not try to discover what I am, for it were better that they were never born than to incur the wrath of the great Axeman. I don't think there is any need of such a warning, for I feel sure the police will always dodge me, as they have in the past. They are wise and know how to keep away from all harm. Undoubtedly, you Orleanians think of me as a most horrible murderer, which I am. But I could be much worse if I wanted to. Trust me, bucko. If I wished, I could pay a visit to your city every night. At will, I could slay thousands of your best citizens, and the worst, for I am in close relationship with the Angel of Death herself. Now, to be exact, at 12:15 earthly time, on next Tuesday night, I'm going to pass over New Orleans. In my infinite mercy, I'm going to make a little proposition to you people. Here it is. I'm very fond of jazz music, and I swear by all the devils in my nether regions that every person shall be spared in whose home a jazz band is in full swing at the time I have just mentioned. If everyone has a jazz band going, well, then, so much the better for you people. One thing is certain, that is that some of your people who do not jazz it out on that specific Tuesday night, if there be any, will get the axe. My axe. Well, as I am cold and crave the warmth of my native Tartarus, and it is about time I leave your earthly home, I will cease my discourse, hoping that thou wilt publish this, that it may go well with thee. I have been, am, and will be the worst spirit that ever existed, either in fact or the realm of fantasy. Deuces, the Axeman.
Examination of the note in present-day terms would most certainly have been discounted. Although serial killers seek to inject themselves into the investigation and draw attention to their outwitting of the police, this letter gave no details of the crimes which only the killer could have been aware. Secondly, it would appear that the supernatural being referring to himself as, quote, the Axeman, end quote, is following in the footsteps of a bloody mentor, Jack the Ripper. The former not only wrote letters to the press about his crimes and taunted the police, but also allegedly left a mysterious message after his fourth murder that, even to this day, historians argue as to its meaning. This leaves the Mrs. Tony message scrawled on the sidewalk not too far from the Maggio murder scene, to leave investigators and historians alike to ponder the demented ramblings of a psychopath. In demanding that the city's inhabitants fill the air with jazz music on the night of the killer's choosing, a city gripped in fear hoped to appease the murderer. A further effort to make sure that the killer would pass over the residents playing his favorite music, John Joseph Davila wrote a special ditty entitled The Mysterious Axeman's Jazz, or Papa Don't Scare Me. Other musicians reviewed the piece with comical criticism, as the playful piece was composed during the bloody aspects of the crimes being committed. Exactly as the Axeman demanded, every home played jazz music on March 19, 1919, in the hopes that the demon would not visit their home that night. The Times-Picayune printed a cartoon lampooning the night of jazz. While the family sat around the piano and made merry, a young mother can be seen at the window casting watch over her family. The danger was real, and the people of New Orleans took the threat with the phantom seriously. The city experienced a temporary reprieve from the murders. That reprieve only lasted until the end of the summer that year. On August 3, 1919, Sarah Lauman, a young, vivacious 19-year-old girl, felt a paralyzing boom on her head as she slept. When she awoke, she suffered a gaping wound in her head and managed to scare off her intruder. The assailant attempted to make his way into the Lauman residence through a window and not through a panel in the door. Miss Lauman recovered from her wounds. At approximately 1:45 a.m. on October 27, 1919, the Axman claimed his alleged last victim. Jefferson Parish Deputy Ben Corcoran was walking home after a long shift at the station when 11-year-old Rosie Pepitone ran into the middle of the street and began screaming that her father had been attacked. Deputy Corcoran asked the little girl to show him where she lived, and when the two arrived at the Pepitone residence, Deputy Corcoran spoke with Esther Pepitone, the victim's wife. Mrs. Pepitone went into the bedroom, followed by the deputy. Corcoran examined Mike Pepitone as he lay on the bed bleeding profusely from a gaping wound in his head. Mrs. Pepitone then said to the police officer, quote, "It looks like the Axman was here and murdered Mike." End quote. An ambulance soon arrived and rushed the bleeding man to the charity hospital. Mike Pepitone later succumbed to his wounds. Instead of the assailant using an axe, this time he used an iron bar with a bolt at the end of it. Other than the utterances of his wife, the police could find no connection between the Pepitone attack and that of the Axman's previous victims. After an intense investigation, police surmised that the attack on Mike Pepitone may have been a revenge killing stemming from his father's association with organized crime a few years earlier. In 1910, Mike's father, Pietro Pepitone, shot and killed a rival grocer by the name of Charles Di Cristina. The elder Pepitone stood trial and was convicted of murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Peter Pepitone later received a pardon and released from Angola State Penitentiary. It may have been a revenge killing for the death of Di Cristina, but why wait 10 years to carry out a vendetta? After the attack on the Pepitones, the city of New Orleans breathed a sigh of relief and almost forgot the horrors brought on to the population by the killer. That is until a newspaper article appeared stating that the mystery of the Axman had been solved. In 1921, newspaper headlines from Los Angeles, California stated that a Mrs. Esther Albano had shot a man by the name of Joseph Mumphrey, who had entered her home uninvited. Mrs. Albano declared that the man demanded money from her and threatened both her and her children if the money were not forthcoming. Police later identified Mrs. Albano as Mrs. Mike Pepitone, the wife of the last alleged victim of the Axman, Mike Pepitone. After the death of her husband, Mrs. Pepitone traveled to California to attend her niece's wedding. While there, she met a man named Angelo Albano, whom she married a short time later. On October 27, 1921, Esther Albano reported her husband missing. Alerted relatives in New Orleans traveled to Los Angeles to help with the search. Allegedly, the man calling himself Joseph Mumphrey repeatedly threatened to kill Angelo Albano if some money were not paid. On one particular night, Mumphrey visited the Albano residence and demanded the money. When he leveled threats to Mrs. Albano, she did what she had to do to protect her family. After her arrest and subsequent trial, Esther Albano was acquitted of all charges. In all, the Axman claimed 8 victims, injuring somewhere between 6 and 10 people. Joseph Mumphrey has been forwarded as the main suspect in this case, but prison records from that time period reflect that Mumphrey had been imprisoned since 1908 and did not secure his release until 1923. So, who was the Axman? Again, we may never know unless there is an eyewitness account that we have never heard of, or a police report where the detectives made some sort of assumption. Still, it does send chills down your spine when you realize this man, if he was a man, was never apprehended. about March 24, 1922, a local farmer in the Hinterkaifeck area of Germany, approximately 43 miles north of Munich, Andreas Gruber, walked among his farm in the outlying areas where he noticed a set of footprints leading up to the family home. Gruber questioned the footprints in the snow, but never reported them to police. Had he done so, perhaps he could have prevented the tragedy yet to happen, which has remained a mystery for almost 100 years. Within the next few days, Gruber and members of the rest of the family thought they heard footsteps in their attic and keys to their tool shed had gone missing. Over the following days, though, people in the vicinity became worried because they had not seen members of the Gruber family at all. 35-year-old Victoria Gabriel and her two children, 7-year-old Kazilia and 2-year-old Joseph, as well as her elderly parents, Andreas and Kazilia, lived on the farm. On April 1, 1922, when young Kazilia did not attend school, nor was the family seen at church that Sunday, neighbors became concerned. On April 4, 1922, Albert Hoffner, a mechanic who worked on a feeding machine at the Gruber farm, proceeded with his duties for several hours without seeing anyone in the Gruber family. When he first arrived that morning, Hoffner tried to get the attention of the family, but he received no answer when he knocked at the door. When he completed his work, again Hoffner went to the door and still received no answer, and then went to a neighbor's residence and reported that he finished fixing the machine, and the family did not answer the door. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a farmer in the area and very close to the Gruber family, formed a small party to investigate the Gruber home. One of the members of the party called out from the barn, and the rest of the search party rushed to see what he discovered. 4 of the family were found in the barn, lying in a neat pile amongst the hay. Each one of the victims had holes in the sides of their heads, as if they were made by some sort of farming tool, a pickaxe. Inside of the house, the searchers located 2-year-old Joseph and the maid, Maria Baumgartner. One of the interesting facets of the case, and one of the most mysterious, was that Baumgartner only started as the Gruber's maid the day before the murders. Autopsies later conducted by Dr. Johann Baptist Ohlmüller learned that Kazilia demonstrated signs of strangulation and suffered from 7 blows to the head, which left her with a fractured skull. Andreas, the patriarch, was found to have his face caked with blood and his cheekbones protruding from his face. Victoria's skull was almost smashed and showed signs of 9 star-shaped wounds, and the right side of her face had been hit with a blunt object. The younger Kazilia's lower jaw had been shattered and her face and neck covered in gaping circular wounds. According to Dr. Ohlmüller, the elder Kazilia, Andreas, and Victoria died instantly as the wounds appeared inflicted with a mattock or pickaxe used for digging and chopping, and the younger Kazilia remained alive and in shock for a long time before eventually succumbing to her wounds. Dr. Ohlmüller concluded that little Kazilia ripped her hair out in clumps as she suffered before she died. Maria Baumgartner was murdered with blows to her skull, and little Joseph died as a result of a singular blow to his face while laying in his cot in Victoria's room. The murderer covered Maria's body with her sheets and Joseph with one of his mother's dresses. In a bizarre twist to the story, it appeared that the assailant did not leave immediately after committing the murders, feeding the barn animals and eating several meals before the discovery of the bodies in the barn. Additionally, neighbors saw smoke coming from the chimney in the days following the murders. After the autopsies were concluded, their heads were removed and sent to a clairvoyant to see if there were any psychic facets that could have been used to identify the assailant. During the interruption of World War II, the heads mysteriously disappeared, never to be seen again. The bodies of the Gruber family had been buried in a cemetery near the town of Weidhofen, and the farmhouse destroyed after all the viable evidence had been extracted from it. Some sensed that the murderer may have been living in the home for more than 6 months before he murdered the Gruber family, as Andreas Gruber made the observation that his family heard footsteps coming from the attic. He also found a newspaper that he had not purchased on his kitchen table. What made Andreas even more alarmed were the footsteps in the snow to the farmhouse. In interviews with the former maid after the murders, she stated she believed the whole homestead was haunted and she left her job because of this belief. She believed she was being watched wherever she moved within the property. A large sum of money was found in the house and several valuables that could have been taken were left untouched. Therefore, the authorities were at odds with what could have been the motive. Immediately after the murders, facts began to emerge as to whom may have been responsible for the Gruber massacre. Merely speculation, mind you, but certain circumstantial facets point to a few suspects. Examining the lives of the victims, police discovered that Victoria, Gruber's daughter, was widowed because of World War I. She had a relationship with Lawrence Schlittenbauer, the leader of the search party that discovered the bodies, and both of them acknowledged that Joseph was Schlittenbauer's child, after a brief period of denial on Schlittenbauer's part. When Andreas interfered in the relationship, the two stopped seeing each other. Schlittenbauer went on to marry someone else, and they had a child. But the baby died a few weeks later. At this point, investigators targeted Schlittenbauer as a prime suspect as a new theory of the crime emerged as to the identity of the killer and his motive. After marrying another woman, authorities theorized that Schlittenbauer became traumatized over the death of his child and held animosity toward Victoria and the Gruber family, for that matter. He later ventured to the Gruber farm and murdered Victoria, her family, and especially little Joseph. Police interviewed Schlittenbauer's actions on the day of the discovery of the Grubers in the barn and the house. He acted suspiciously and nonchalant, viewing and handling the bodies without signs of repulsion. Schlittenbauer also exhibited an uncanny knowledge of his way around the farm. Even after questioning Schlittenbauer, the police explained away his behavior when the bodies were discovered as shock, disbelief, and they reasoned that his knowledge of the farm was as a result of the relationship he had with Victoria. In 1952, Crescentia Mayer told her priest while on her deathbed that her two brothers actually committed the Hinterkaifeck murders. Adolf Gump, one of the brothers, was questioned in 1922 but later released and since had died. Anton Gump, the other brother, had no evidence that demonstrated his presence at the murder scene, so police released him from their custody also. Long after the Hinterkaifeck massacre, another theory of the murders was that political groups rising in Germany at the time murdered the family. Along with this speculation, some believe that the Gruber farm was actually a weapons cache for the Nazi Party. The investigators determined that the killer knew the family and the surroundings, continued to upkeep the property and its livestock after the murders, and held an extreme personal animus to the inhabitants based upon the brutality of the slayings. The case was then closed in 1923 and would remain that way until 2007. In that year, the Furstenfeldbruck Police Academy tried their hand at solving the Hinterkaifeck case. But due to privacy concerns and respect for surviving family members of the Grubers, the theory remains a secret. It is highly unlikely that we will ever know the identity nor the motives behind the Hinterkaifeck massacre.
Thank you for watching our marathon, and if you haven't subscribed, please look at some of the other episodes that we have. If you'd like to support our channel, we're on Subscribestar, Rumble, and we have an account with PayPal. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, so if you want to give us some support there, that would be great. This is Alan Goto, your host of True Crime, Man's Dark Imagination. Until next time.